discuss today is setting priorities in spiritual growth. I think for most people, that's a natural concern because we're all faced with a number of different areas in which we think growth would be appropriate for us, and we're not able to handle all of them at the same time. So naturally, we have to set priorities. There is an intellectual puzzle here that I'd like to just deal with first. Some people say, what do you mean set priorities? Just do everything right. Do everything right. That seems like a tall order. Is that really possible? And they say, of course it's possible. Look, the same creator that created you and created your capabilities created the Torah. And in the Torah, he said, this is what I'm commanding you to do. So obviously, he must have given you the ability to do all those things. It would be foolish and cruel to say to a person, I'm ordering you to do X, even though you can't do X. And presumably, if I order you to do X and you don't do X, then you're going to be punished for it, even when you can't do it. So obviously, it must be that you're able to do it. And there are statements like, a person can pass every test. A person can conquer every challenge. We do have statements like that in our tradition. So from this point of view, the idea of setting priorities is just irresponsible. Just do everything right. But that's a mistake. And I will first show you sources from which it's clear that it's a mistake, and then I'll explain to you why it's a mistake. And just as a logical footnote, there's a big difference between proving something and explaining something. A great deal of science is dedicated to explaining why things happen even after they know that they happen. You observe them or you test them with an experiment, but you don't know what makes it happen. The first is a proof that the phenomenon is correct, and the second is an explanation why it works that way. So there's a big difference between proving something and explaining why it is so. But let me start with some references which I think demonstrate that the idea of doing everything right just by a decision is not correct. And then I'll try to give you an explanation as to why that's so, and then we'll talk about the practical side of actually setting priorities. I'm going to quote 3 passages from the Rambam, Maimonides. First comes from the 5th chapter of the Laws of Tshuva, very beginning. He says, Rishus l'chol adam nesuna lo. Rishus here means power. Every person has the power. Imrotza l'hatos atzmo l'derech tova v'liyos tzadik. If he wants to incline himself to a good path and be righteous, the power is in his hands. And if he wants to incline himself to an evil path and become evil, the power is in his hands. Now, the Rambam's vocabulary here requires some thought. Okay, we have free will, and he's telling us that with free will, you can either do good or evil, right or wrong. That's what he's telling us. So why didn't he say it that way? Why didn't he simply say, because you have free will, you could be a tzaddik or you could be a rasha. You could be righteous or you could be wicked. No. He says you could incline yourself to a good path and be righteous. There are 3 steps here. First, incline to the path, and then you walk on the path, and then you become righteous. That sounds like it's a process. It's not an instantaneous decision and with an instantaneous perfect outcome, but it's a process of development. That would mean that just snapping your fingers and being perfect is not what's being described. That's one source. Second source comes from Hilchos Deos. There he's talking about character development. And the Rambam organizes character traits on continua. There's a certain type of feature of your character, and there's too much, too little, and some kind of medium range, which is the appropriate range that your character should be in. So let's take spending money. So there are some people who can't hold on to a nickel. We give it to them, and it's gone. They spend it on foolish, irrelevant stuff or dangerous stuff. They just can't hold on to money. There are other people who can't spend. Not even on themselves can they spend. These are the people who live terribly impoverished lives. When they die, you find in the mattress $250,000. They have plenty of money. They just couldn't spend it, not even on themselves. Those two character traits are sick. The appropriate character trait is to be able to spend when, logically, the thing you're spending on is worth more than the money to you than you're paying for it, where it will do more good for you than holding on to the money will. That's in between these two extremes. Now the Rambam says, suppose a person finds himself at one of the extremes. What should he do? So, given what I've told you so far, you think the answer is simple. Well, move to the middle. You're at one of the extremes, you're in a bad place, go to the good place, which is the middle. Rambam doesn't say that. The Rambam says, first move to the other extreme, and then gradually go back to the middle. So think what that means. It means you're in a bad place. Well, my first piece of advice to you is go to another bad place. And then, after you go to the other bad place, then you can go to a good place. But why should you have to do that? Just go to the good place. Well, apparently, that's not practical. And it's not something which you can expect. The psychological idea here is this. Very often, the person who's in one of the extremes knows he's in a bad place. It's not as if he's rationalizing it or justifying it. He's suffering, and he knows he's suffering. He just hasn't got the willpower to break out of it. How is he going to develop the willpower to break out of it and to end up somewhere in the middle? This is, by the way, something like addiction. Very often, addicts will tell you, I wish I didn't do this. I know it's bad. I know I'm suffering. I'm causing suffering to other people. I just can't help it. And the truth is, to a certain extent, it's right, or it's either they can't or it's very hard, and they need help. And there are techniques for limiting addictions and for curbing and for breaking addictions. There are techniques for doing that. So the Rambam is describing a technique where you use your willpower not to go to the middle and do what's right, but you use your willpower to go to the opposite extreme. It's something like telling an alcoholic, just have 2 or 3 drinks. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. You can drink socially and let him leave it at that. No. After 2 or 3, he's gone. He's going to be under the table. Or as one recovered alcoholic told me, that's a little naive. The alcoholic at the party can control himself and drink 2 or 3 drinks and then go home and drink a whole bottle. So it isn't as if he has to embarrass himself in public, and therefore you can't know who's an alcoholic. Because if he behaves normally at a party, that wouldn't prove it. So he can't just drink a moderate amount. He can't do that. So what do we do for addicts like that? We put them in a situation where they can't get any alcohol for 6 months, where the drive to drink dissipates, and then sometimes they have to be free of alcohol for the rest of their lives. There are cases where they can learn gradually to drink in an acceptable manner. But the first step is to go to the opposite extreme. Now, when it's like alcohol, so you say, okay, so for 6 months you didn't have alcohol. That's not bad. But here, if you're going from, let's say, losing every nickel to not being able to spend the nickel, that's bad also. And Rambam says it's bad. So you go from one bad position to another bad position so that the psychological pressure of the first position is broken. Once you break that psychological pressure, then you can move to a middle area where you're doing the right thing. Here it's clear, the Rambam is telling you, just being perfect on the basis of a decision is not something that's expected. That's the second place in the Rambam. Third place in the Rambam, where he describes learning of Torah, especially training children in learning Torah from a young age and charting their development. And the Rambam says, you motivate the child on the basis of what his present educational level and maturity level is. For little children, it's candy. And for bigger children, it could be toys. And in our context, it could be trips. And for older children, you can motivate them by appealing to honor. People will respect you and they'll give you positions of authority and so on and so on. And then he says, when his intellect matures and when he learns better what the world is and how the world is working, and he realizes that there's a creator, and the creator created the universe in order to enable the human being to develop all of his great capacities in the best possible fashion, so as to end up in the next world in a relationship with the creator, which is the greatest possible level of pleasure that's possible, so that the ultimate success of life depends upon this. Then, at that point, he comes to the ability to serve God at what we call lishma, out of love of the Creator who commanded it. Those are the words that he has in the 10th chapter of the Laws of Tshuva. But that's a process. And he doesn't say, okay, all the prior steps are before you're 13. Because once you're 13, so then you're responsible to do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu told you to do. And therefore, from your 13th birthday, then it's only lishma, out of love of God and nothing else. No, it doesn't say that, and it's certainly not what he intends. It depends upon the development of the individual person. So if I'm taking this child and trying to enable him to grow towards this goal, it's a very gradual process of growth. So the Rambam is making it clear that simply to snap your fingers and become perfect is not something that's practical, it's not something that's expected. That's the proof. Now, the explanation works like this. First of all, when someone sets up a system of commands, that's where the critics started from. He commanded us, so he must have given us the ability to fulfill the commands. It depends upon what the point of the commands is. If the point of the commands is to achieve immediate compliance, then indeed it would be expected that if the Creator set up a system of commands, then he would give us the ability to fulfill them all. But if the system of commands is to set up a system of growth, a system of ideals, a system of goals to approximate step by step, then the conclusion doesn't follow. You say, well, a command doesn't sound like that. When I tell you to do something, doesn't it mean that I expect you to do it? Maybe yes or maybe no. It depends upon what kind of command it is, and it depends upon what your capacities are and who's giving the command. In our case, Kadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm commanding you to do X. If you're not able to do X, and therefore you don't do X, I don't hold you responsible. I don't hold you liable. You won't suffer any punishment or any condemnation for not doing it because you weren't able to do it. But the command you have to grow to, your ultimate responsibility is to fulfill that command, or to come as far as you possibly can to fulfilling that command. And that being the case, you're not just off the hook because you can't do it. On the contrary, the command still applies to you, and you still have to work towards it. You simply can't be held responsible and suffer a penalty for the fact that you don't do it when you can't do it. So that being the case, you have to look at the set of commands. By the way, I recommend this to people who come to the yeshiva, who come raw, and they're sitting and learning, a few hours a day. They're picking up a lot of information about what the Jewish responsibilities of life are. And often they say to me, this is overwhelming. My notebook has in it already 27 different things that I have to do. And I'm learning 2 or 3 a day. In a month I'm going to have 30 or 50. I don't know how I can deal with this. I say to them, imagine that you are getting instructions as to a picture of the ideal Jewish life. That's what it is. Now you have to work towards that life as best you can. And that doesn't mean you have to do everything right away. So it's simply not true that you're expected to do everything right away, and you're not a failure if you don't, because that's not what's expected. Now, the other thing we mentioned, and this is a little bit more subtle, well, doesn't it say that you can pass every test and you can succeed in overcoming every challenge? Yes, it does. It does say that. But then the question is to turn the idea back on itself and ask, how do I recognize a test? How do I recognize a challenge? Okay, there's something in my way, but given the idea that I can pass every test, then the thing that's in my way is only a test if I can pass it. But if I'm not able to pass it, then it's not a test. You can't tell just because there's an obstacle in your way that it's a test. Maybe it's something you have to just give up and do something else. Or, in more subtle cases, you have to live with the frustration of being unable to remove the obstacle. This you will find when you become parents. One of the most difficult elements of being a parent is where you see your child suffering because of some problem, and you know the solution. You know the solution. But your child is either 2 years old or 14 years old. In between, there's a much better condition. And he can't take it from you. If you tell him what the solution is, he can't take it from you. He won't trust you. He doesn't want to accept your authority. He wants to become independent. He's American. And I say that with a sneer. But he's suffering. And you can't do it. You can't do it. So the smart thing to do under those conditions is tell the solution to someone he trusts. So he'll get the solution from someone he trusts, and he won't suffer. But it's very painful for the parent because you love the child and you're responsible for the child, and you could help him, he just can't take it from you. So the wrong thought is, if I'm supposed to be his parent and I'm supposed to be responsible for him, then I must find a way for him to take it from me. Because if that's my responsibility, then God must have given me the ability to do it. So I have to find the way to do it. That can be dead wrong. Maybe what Akash Baruch Hu wants is for you to live with your frustration that you can't do it and find another person who can do it for him. This is an obstacle you can't overcome. And since it's an obstacle you can't overcome, it's not a test. Not every obstacle is a test. So you take the principle that you can pass every test and you use that to identify what is a test and what isn't a test. Then that takes the pressure off, because there will be obstacles in your way which you can't overcome and which therefore aren't tests. And one of them is that if you grew up in a non-religious home and you decide at the age of 16 or 19 or 21 to adopt a religious lifestyle, it is not a test that by the end of the week you should be doing everything right. That's not the test. That's an obstacle that you can't overcome, and therefore it isn't a test. So that's the explanation. Are we together so far? Okay, so now, the last background remark. Don't think that this issue is only an issue for people who didn't grow up in a religious home. people who grew up in religious homes are given a head start in the platform from which their growth begins. But they too, if they are growth-oriented, which they should be, and they're self-aware, they too will have various different areas of life which need improvement, and they too will have to set priorities. I think setting priorities is something that's an issue for every Jew, no matter what his initial background is. So here's a thought which some people think, well, priorities? The Torah has its own priorities. When you have various mitzvahs, for example, some are more important than others. If it's a question, let's say, of keeping Shabbos or making blessings before you eat food, well, Shabbos is a biblical commandment. Making blessings before you eat food is rabbinic. Shabbos is mentioned in the 10 pronouncements at Sinai, and it's mentioned a dozen times in the Torah. And blessings are rabbinic, which were brought into existence 1,000 years after the giving of the Torah at Sinai. Surely, Shabbos should come first, and blessings should come afterwards. But that's not true. The criterion of priority is not the legal priority of the mitzvah. The criterion of priority is how will it contribute to the person's growth. There is an actual case on record. I'm not going to mention who the rabbi was because he didn't publicize it, but I know the case and I know who the rabbi is. A 14-year-old girl decided that she wanted to live a Torah lifestyle. She was, of course, living at home with her parents. And one of the things she wanted to do was keep Shabbos. And her parents said, you will not keep Shabbos in this house. Not we won't keep Shabbos to please you and to make things easy for you. No, you won't keep Shabbos in this house. So she asked this question of one of the legal decisors. This was, I guess, 50 years ago. And he said to this 14-year-old girl, don't keep Shabbos. Because you're not able to keep Shabbos. Because although your parents don't have the authority to tell you not to keep Shabbos, but setting up a war between a 14-year-old and her parents, it's very, very likely that she's going to lose the war. I actually saw this when I was in university, and one of the people in our group was a young man who wanted to join part of the group and wanted to become religious, and his parents were against it. They took him out of the university for a year and sent him to a psychiatrist, and when he came back the year after that, he was cured. He was cured. Didn't associate with us, didn't have anything to do with us. They programmed him and pressured him, and he was cured. They actually beat it out of him. So this rabbinic authority said, wait until you can move out of your house and be on your own, and then you'll keep Shabbos. What was he saying? He was saying, you're not able to do it. And since you're not able to do it, the right reaction should be, of course, to pray to Kadosh Baruch Hu that he should give you the ability to do it, and so forth and so on. But also, don't feel guilty about the fact that you're not keeping Shabbos, because under these conditions, you can't do it. So again, the idea is that there can be obstacles which are not tests, because they are simply impossible to achieve. So here, if she had wanted to make blessings before she eats, and she doesn't have to make them out loud, she can whisper them or just move her lips when her parents aren't looking, then it would have been appropriate for her to do that, because that she can do. So you have to take serious consideration of the psychological consequences of what you do. Here's an example for men. What about wearing a yarmulke? And what about wearing tzitzis, fringes, four-cornered garment? Well, the big difference is a yarmulke is a public demonstration. A four-cornered garment can be worn under your shirt. No one will know. No one has to know. There, wearing the four-cornered garment is voluntary, although it's customary, and so is the yarmulke customary. But the crucial consideration is how difficult is it, what consequences will it have in our times, when people became religious and wanted to cover their heads, and their families and others, they didn't want to face that, they wore a beret, they wore some kind of hat, which, so he has a hat, maybe he has a bald spot. Why is he covering his head the whole time? Who knows? And that way you don't have to face it. So those things need to be taken into account, and the way then that you decide what the next step should be is thinking about its effect on your long-term development, not on its legal priority. And one of the ways to measure this, I can give you an analogy to something which probably is familiar to you, is athletic training. Training for a sport or just athletic workouts to improve your strength. How do you decide when to push yourself? How do you decide when to up your output? There is an old motto, which is dead wrong: no pain, no gain. That's dead wrong. That's true for stretches, but it's not true for increasing your strength. Because if you feel pain, you're risking injury. And if you suffer an injury, then you can't train at all, usually. And that's very bad. So if you are questioning, shall I, instead of doing 50 push-ups, do 70 push-ups, or instead of running 2 miles, I run 3 miles, if that's your question, you ask yourself, what's the probability of injury? If the probability of injury is 10%, and if you succeed, the probability of strengthening yourself is 90%, you don't do it, because you can't afford a 10% probability of injury. Because injury could knock you out, knock out 6 months of training. So the same thing is true when taking a step forward in your spiritual growth. What's the likelihood that you'll be able to sustain it? If the decision, I'm going to question this in a moment, but if the decision is, okay, this is my new project, I'm doing this, what's the likelihood you'll be able to sustain it? If the likelihood you'll be able to sustain it is 70%. So 30% likelihood you're going to have to give it up because you won't be able to maintain it. The consequence of giving up a decision, not for everybody, not always, but very often the consequence is, so I wasn't ready for that. And I thought I was ready, and I wasn't ready. So then I can't really trust my judgment. How will I know what decision to make next time? And if I can't trust my judgment, so then how will I progress at all? And then maybe this isn't the right project for me altogether. I can't trust my judgment. Sometimes I fail. And then, maybe I've just on the wrong track altogether. There's the possibility of a downward spiral here, which can cause you to lose the whole project. You don't want to take that chance. That's like getting injured and not being able to continue. So you want to be pretty sure, quite sure, that you'll be able to succeed when you take a step forward. There's something called behavioral therapy, which preaches exactly the same thing. If a person has a bad habit, they say, now I'm not pledging allegiance to behavioral therapy. Those of you who know me know I don't pledge allegiance to any of the psychological theories. My impression is that each psychological theory has a very thin slice of the truth, and its failure is to blow it up as if that were the whole person. Sometimes these techniques are successful for certain populations, given by certain trainers, and therefore they're useful. But one of the techniques of behavioral therapy is to break down the progress you want into small steps, and to be guaranteed that each step can be successfully done. And then have a reinforcement, a reward for taking that step. If you break down the project into 100 steps, 100 easy steps. Okay, if you tried to do it in 6 steps, you'd maybe do it in a week. You break it down to 100, it'll take 2 months, but you'll get there. Almost guaranteed you'll get there. Because each step is easy, and you get a payoff for doing each step, and the steps accumulate. So same thing is true here. If you have a doubt as to whether you can sustain it, so then you break it down into small steps, and you make it into steps that you are quite confident that you can successfully achieve. I have a motto, and I would put it on the wall. I think it's very important. Don't despise small steps. The Yetzer Hara, who never gives up, says to you, "Are you kidding? That's what you're going to do? Are you 6 years old? Come on, that's trivial. That's not worthy of you. There's no nobility in that. You're behaving like a child. Take responsibility and do something big." That's a trap. That's a trap. Suppose you're trying to learn French, and you have a vocabulary, 10 words a week, and a simple sentence, and so on and so on, and someone said to you, "Take medieval French poetry and dive in. What's the matter with you? 10 words a week? What kind of? Excuse me, it's a foreign language. I hope that in a year or two I'll become competent in French." That's the way you get a foreign language. You'd understand that has to be done slowly. So, or if you're trying to gain the coordination to ride a unicycle, like on one wheel, okay? You wouldn't say, just go downhill. You do it in a place where there's padding on the floor, and make sure that if you fall, you won't get injured. Because these are things that's the attitude that you should have with these things as well. So if you use athletic training as a kind of touchstone for how you should set priorities in your spiritual growth, I think that's a good comparison. Now, there's another way to protect yourself, and that is when you make the decision to take a step forward, make the decision tentatively. Don't make it, "This is my project and now I'm going to do this." But rather, "This is what I'm going to try out next. I'll try it out for 2 weeks, I'll try it out for a month, and then I'll evaluate whether I really was ready for it or not." That's a very good technique. Because if after a month you find that it's not working, you didn't commit yourself to it in the first place. You didn't make a judgment that it's right for me. You said, what's right for me is to try it. So I tried it, and it didn't work. It was a test. Testing is a good thing, and it's good to follow the outcome of the test. So then you don't lose if you give it up after a month, and you say, okay, next year I'll try it again. That's a way to protect yourself from the bad consequences of the decision. On the other hand, these are sort of complementary factors. Sometimes students come to me and say, should I do this next? He's asking me, should he do this next? So let's see what the consequence would be if I say yes and if I say no. If I say no, he won't do it probably. That's why he's asking me. If I say yes, he'll do it, but suppose it gets tough. Well, in the back of his mind will be, he said yes. That's what he said. But it's really getting tough. I guess he was wrong. He doesn't have any personal commitment to make it work because he's only doing it because I said yes. And therefore he's less committed to making it work. So very often I give him the third answer. What's the third answer besides yes or no? The third answer is, I'm not sure. You're asking me whether you're ready to do this? I'm not sure. Maybe yes, maybe no, I don't know, I'm not sure. Then what happens is, sometimes he comes back and says, I thought it over, and I am ready. Okay. He now says he's ready. Then he now has a commitment to make it work so that his judgment won't be false. That's good. That's good. Sometimes I might contradict him altogether and say, no, you're definitely not ready. That could happen also. But the person himself who's taking the step forward should have a commitment to make it work, even protecting himself that if it doesn't work, he isn't a failure. But he should have a commitment to make it work. Otherwise, he loses a certain probability that it will in fact work. So it's a combination of both doing it experimentally, but the experiment is to see whether I can do this. And therefore, his I can do this is going to be part of his psychology, and it gives him a push forward. This, by the way, is one of the techniques behind marriage. Rabbi Schiller, you should be well, taught us this many, many years ago. What's the difference between living together and being married? Well, a difference. There are lots of differences. One difference is this. If something goes wrong, something gets tough in the relationship, if you're living together, the thought in the back of both persons' mind is time to get out and get another relationship. That's why I didn't get married after all. I want to be free. I want to make my own decisions. I don't want to be trapped. But that means that when the problem arises, you have much less motivation to solve the problem. Because always in the back of your mind is it now time to quit? Is it now time to get somebody else? And that saps your motivation. It's just the difference between, and this is in Jewish warfare, the rules of Jewish warfare. If you're besieging a city, whether you surround the city from all four sides, or you only surround it from three sides. Why would you surround it from only three sides? For the fourth side, they can get ammunition, they can get new soldiers, they can get food and supplies. Yes, that's true. They can, and also every soldier in the city knows that when there's a time to run, he could run. He could save himself. And you want him to have that in his mind. You want him to be thinking, shall I run or shall I not run? Because that saps his motivation to fight. I forget where I read this, but there was a landing from the sea by soldiers who had to fight against a battle. And this was like 200 years ago, 300 years ago. And the first thing that the officer in charge did when they disembarked on the shore was to burn the boats. So now it's fight or die. There's no way to get out. And then they're going to fight because they don't want to die. And that's a different matter. So that's the difference between when you're married and you know that it's a real deal to get divorced. Then it gives you much more motivation to solve the problems. That's a great benefit. It's a great benefit. And having said that, just 1 second. Hi, I'm giving a shiur. Yes, I'm teaching now. Okay. Bye-bye. That's the Rebbitzin. When you'll be married, it's a good piece of advice. Always answer your wife. So, what was I saying now? Oh yes. So when you're married, so then it's a great disruption in life to get divorced, and that gives you the motivation to want to solve the problem. That's one of the great advantages of marriage. Oh yes, and then people told me when I told them this, they said, "Oh, I hear you, Rabbi. I hear you. It's very logical, but I'm 23." And I'm not going to get married till I'm 33, 35. But I'll remember. I remember what you said, that. But in the meantime, life is life, and I'll do what I'll do. And then when I get married, I'll remember how important that is. But the trouble is that if you've been having casual relationships for 15 years, you build up certain habits. You build up certain expectations. You build up certain responses. And you can't, at age 35, snap your fingers and become a different person. And that's why people who live together before marriage have worse divorce statistics than people who don't. Even though you'd think it was the opposite, because they live together, you can weed out certain incompatibilities, which is true, you can. But you're programming in yourself a certain attitude towards relationships, which is crippling later on. So that's what you want to avoid. When taking steps forward, you want to have your motivation in, but you don't want to be so locked in that if it doesn't succeed, then you feel like you're a failure and come to question the whole project. Then there's another feature here. So we're going to experiment. Okay, I'll try this for a month and see if it works. See if it works, see if I work. Language is tricky here. Okay, the month goes by. How do you evaluate whether it worked or not? How do you make the evaluation? Here, it's very important to make a total bottom line evaluation. I'll give you an example of what I mean. So let's say I get up at 7 o'clock every morning. The meeting is at 7:30, and I go to daven. Somebody says, learning before davening. It's a different davening. It's a different day. I'm just telling you from experience. Yeah, it's really worth it. So I think, wow, let's see. I get up at 7, daven at 7:30. If I got up at 6, I'd have an extra hour. I could learn and then daven. I wonder. He said so, I've heard of this. Maybe it's worth it. So I make a chavrusa, because that's the only way I'll get out of bed. I make a chavrusa, and the alarm rings at 6 o'clock. Yeah, but he's waiting for me. I can't, at this point, I come to the base medrash, I learn. I do it for a month. Now the month is over. How should I make the bottom line evaluation, whether it worked or not? Should I say, well, did I do it every day? I did it every day. So it worked. No, that's a mistake. Let's see. When did you used to go to sleep? 10 o'clock? And the last month you're going to sleep at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock? Still 10 o'clock? How were you from 8 to 10? Were you kind and considerate, interested in other people's welfare? When temptations came up, were you strong enough to resist them? Or did your interpersonal sensitivity go down and your resistance to temptation go down because you're more tired now, because you lost an hour's sleep? Well, then add up the benefit of learning an hour before davening with the losses from 8 to 10 and ask whether the package is worth it. Because almost every change in life has ups and downs. And you can't just look at the success of the up, you have to look at the cost of the down. And very often you could say, it was wonderful, it was inspiring, it definitely improved my day, but what it cost me from 8 to 10 at night made it not worth it. It's got to be a bottom line evaluation, which takes into account all of the consequences. So now, these are some of the sensitivities that are important for making these kinds of decisions of setting priorities. Another factor, a very important factor, is your environment. And this works two ways. You come to yeshiva, the pattern of life in yeshiva usually is already somewhat beyond the individual habits of the individual person. To take steps forward to conform to a pattern that's already public makes it much easier. Because you have the support of everyone when you take the step forward, and you probably are sensitive to the fact that if they're doing it and I'm not, well, I'm a little out of step, and that could be an irritating factor, both of which push you forward. That's quite different from undertaking something which no one else is doing. There's much more resistance there. It requires much more effort there. And that means it's a good idea to invest in the ones that are easy to do. In fact, starting with things that are easy to do is another good psychological investment. And a reason for that is very simple. You know what inertia is? Inertia in physical science is that a thing continues in its present state of motion unless some force is applied to it. That present state of motion might be being stationary, like this book, and it will stay there until something pushes it. Or if it's moving, it will move, continue to move in a straight line until some force is applied to it. So there's inertia of being stationary and there's inertia of motion. If you start with the things that are easy to do, then you build up inertia, because since they're easy to do, you'll do them. And if you do them one after the other, you get used to doing, you get used to growing, you get used to moving. then it's much easier to take on something that's a little harder because you have the push of moving and growing behind you. So that's a reason to start with the easy things. On the other hand, suppose you leave the environment. You're in yeshiva for a year or 2 years, or for the rest of your life, which is the ideal. And no, when you leave yeshiva, you don't go back to the real world. You're in the real world. When you leave yeshiva, you go back to dreams and fantasies. Okay, enough for the commercial. So now, just as it was easy to do these things in yeshiva, and you took advantage of that, you should also take account of the fact that when you leave yeshiva, it's going to be much more difficult to do them. And you should lower your standards. Don't expect to live up to the pattern of life that you establish in yeshiva when you leave yeshiva. And well, there's another point I'm going to make for all of this. Be realistic about the fact that in yeshiva you were getting public support, and that helped you with your motivation, and out of yeshiva you're not going to be getting that public support. And therefore you should only require of yourself standards that are relevant to those conditions. Now, one final, I would say, very important feature of this process is to have advisors. It's just like, again, in sports. And I exercise regularly. I believe in it. And I even go to exercise therapy because I had tendinitis, terrible tendinitis. And they, Baruch Hashem, took care of that. And they also give me things to do which make me much more healthy. Once when I was, like 25 years ago, when I was working out more seriously, my routine was to run 3 miles in a half hour. And the trainer said to me once, just offhand, he said, I think you could do 4.5 miles in 45 minutes. I said, really? In one shot? And he said, yes. That's a 50% increase. I said, but I'm 60 years old. He said, yeah, okay, but you could do it. Okay, he's a professional trainer. I'm just the guy doing the running. So I trusted him, and I did it. I was really surprised. I didn't kill myself to do it. I had no idea that I was able to do it. So I said to myself, he knows a lot better than I do what my abilities are. And similarly, when I wanted to do something, and he saw how I was doing it, and he saw how much effort it cost me, he said, you're not ready for that. I was doing it. He said, yeah, I know you're doing it. You're not ready for it. It's not going to be good for you. It's important to have a trainer who has had the experience of seeing other people develop, seeing what injuries look like, and knowing the techniques and reading the literature, be able to enable you to make intelligent decisions about this matter. Same thing is true with personal development. To have a trainer who has that wisdom so that you can prevent yourself from making foolish errors on both sides. Asking too much of yourself or asking too little of yourself is a very, very valuable resource. I had a close friend. I say had because I'm not in touch with him. I've been in touch with him for 30 years. He told me that he was working on a problem. He didn't tell me what the problem was, but it was like something which he habitually failed at. And he was working on it, and he made a great effort, and he put himself through some kind of training process, and he cured it. He wasn't doing it anymore. And he was so happy, and he was so pleased with himself, and he was religious at the time, so he thanked God for the help and so on and so on, that he went to his spiritual advisor, and he said, I just want to let you know that I, Baruch Hashem, licked this problem, and I've managed to outgrow it, and I'm in a much better condition. And the spiritual advisor said, it'll come back. He told me he was crushed. He was crushed. He's ready to go on, turn the page, turn the corner. He said it'll come back. And 2 years later, he came to me and said, came back. Okay, but if you have somebody who can know that, know yourself better than you know yourself, and can be realistic for you, that's a very valuable resource. So to invest in a relationship with somebody who can give you that kind of advice is a very important thing. Now, this doesn't have to be a person with a white beard who's 80 years old. It can be someone who's further down the pike than you are, and has had enough time to gather experience from his own experience, the experience of his other friends and people that he knows, so that he can give you the benefit of that experience. And of course, such a person won't be infallible, but you'll do a lot better with such a person than you will without. And another point about such people, different people go to different yeshivas or have different spiritual advisors, and you can have two people whose background is pretty similar and whose psychology is pretty similar, and the advice they get from their spiritual advisors is quite different. And then the question naturally arises, well, who's right? If he got quite different advice, am I not taking a risk that maybe the advice for me isn't good for me, or isn't the right, or isn't the best advice for me? There's a failure of logic there. There may be more than one way to maximize a person's capabilities. And they could both be ideal. It's not just as one size fits this particular problem. So working on your endurance first and your coordination second will get you a certain type of development. Working on your coordination first and endurance second will get you a different type of development. And it's not obvious that the one is better than the other. There may be two different ways to produce better performance. So it doesn't have to be that there's only one way. Even for people, I said, with similar psychology, similar background, there's only one way that would maximize the potential. Of course, the different ways will give you a different maximization, but it's not obvious that one is better than the other. If you have three things you want to maximize, getting 90% of A and 50% of B and 30% of C might be one way of doing it. Another way of doing it might be to reverse the percentages. It's still not the same average. And both of them are maximizing as much as you can do for A, B, and C, only in different ways. So one doesn't have to feel that because there are differences of opinion in terms of development that one's in danger of losing out. These are people who spent their lives learning this and using these techniques and seeing the results of the techniques, and taking advice from such a person will definitely improve what you would have over yourself. Okay, questions? Okay, just some advice about setting spiritual priorities.
Thank you.